this episode, we begin with one of the most important habits in responsible artificial intelligence, AI, work, and it has nothing to do with model architecture, prompt design, or technical tools. Before any organization builds an AI system, it needs to define the business context and the use case clearly enough that everyone involved understands what problem is being addressed, why the problem matters, who is affected, and what good performance would actually look like in the real world. New learners are often tempted to imagine that AI projects begin with selecting a model or collecting a pile of data, but mature governance begins earlier than that. It begins with careful thinking about purpose, workflow, decisions, and constraints. If that early thinking is weak, the system may still look impressive in a demonstration, but it will usually become harder to govern, harder to explain, and more likely to create confusion or harm once people start depending on it. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Business context is the wider situation surrounding a proposed AI system. It includes the organization's goals, the process that already exists, the people involved, the pressures shaping the work, the problems the organization is trying to solve, and the consequences of getting the solution wrong. A team that skips this step may think it is building an intelligent tool, when in reality it is building a technical answer to a poorly defined organizational question. That is one of the most common reasons AI efforts fail. The system may produce outputs, but the outputs do not fit the actual workflow, do not support meaningful decisions, or do not solve the problem leadership thought it was solving. Business context helps an organization understand not only what it wants the system to do, but also why that task matters in the first place and how the task fits into a larger set of human, legal, operational, and strategic realities. A use case is narrower than business context, but it depends on business context to make sense. The business context explains the environment, while the use case describes the specific way the proposed AI system will be used inside that environment. A use case should be concrete enough that someone outside the project can understand the task, the user, the trigger for use, the output produced, and the decision or action that follows. If a team says it wants to use AI to improve customer service, that is not yet a use case. It is an aspiration. A real use case would sound more like using AI to draft first response suggestions for support staff handling common password reset questions, while leaving final replies to human reviewers. That distinction matters because governance becomes possible only when the organization moves from broad ambition to a defined interaction between a specific task, a specific user, and a specific result inside a real process. One reason this early definition work matters so much is that organizations often confuse the business problem with the technical task. The business problem might be that support teams are overloaded, students wait too long for responses, analysts miss important patterns in documents, or employees spend too much time searching for internal knowledge. The technical task is something narrower, such as summarization, classification, extraction, ranking, drafting, or question answering. If a team jumps straight to the technical task without clarifying the business problem, it may build the wrong kind of system or measure the wrong kind of success. A beautifully performing classifier may still fail if the true organizational problem was not triage, but inconsistent decision criteria or a broken escalation process. This is why good AI governance begins by asking what is broken or limited in the current state, what the organization wants to improve, and whether the proposed technical task actually addresses that need instead of simply adding another layer of software. Another essential part of defining context is identifying the stakeholders, and that means more than naming the project sponsor and the technical team. Stakeholders include the people who will operate the system, the people who will rely on its outputs, the people whose data may shape the system, and the people who may be affected by its decisions or recommendations even if they never touch the interface directly. A hiring tool affects applicants, recruiters, managers, and compliance teams. A student support tool affects students, advisors, administrators, and perhaps parents or guardians depending on the setting. A content moderation tool affects moderators, platform users, policy teams, and public trust in the service. When these stakeholders are not identified early, the system often ends up designed around the convenience of the builders rather than the needs and rights of the people living with its consequences. Good business context, therefore, includes a serious look at who matters, who is exposed, who carries the burden when the system fails, and who should have a voice before development begins. Closely connected to stakeholder identification is the question of what role the system will actually play in decision-making. Some AI systems generate content. Some rank options. Some flag anomalies. Some recommend actions. Some predict likely outcomes. Some assist people in completing repetitive work, while others influence decisions with serious consequences. Governance becomes much clearer when an organization defines whether the system is meant to advise, prioritize, draft, classify, or automate a particular part of the process. That is because the legal, ethical, and operational stakes often depend less on the technology itself than on the power the output has over human action. A system that offers optional drafting help is governed differently from a system that places people into risk categories or determines who receives extra scrutiny. Before building anything, the team should be able to state exactly what the AI output will do, what it will not do, and what level of human judgment remains necessary around it. Scope is another area where early discipline prevents later confusion. Many organizations start with a modest idea and then allow the proposed use case to grow into something much broader without pausing to revisit governance. A team may begin by wanting a tool that summarizes customer messages and then slowly expand expectations so the same system is asked to detect fraud, estimate customer sentiment, draft responses, and recommend account actions. That kind of scope drift makes systems harder to test, harder to explain, and harder to supervise because the original use case no longer matches the real one. A well-defined use case therefore needs boundaries. It should identify what the system is intended to handle, what is out of scope, what kinds of inputs are expected, what kinds of outputs are allowed, and what situations require escalation or fallback to a different process. These boundaries are not signs of weakness. They are signs that the organization understands the system well enough to govern it responsibly instead of treating it like a general answer to every nearby problem. Success criteria should also be defined before building begins, because teams often measure whatever is easiest rather than what actually matters. If the organization says success means the model is fast, that may hide the fact that it is also inaccurate in the hardest cases. If success means a high score on one benchmark, that may hide the fact that users do not trust the outputs or use them incorrectly. If success means reduced handling time, that may hide the fact that quality, fairness, or user understanding got worse. A strong pre-build process asks what outcomes matter in the actual business context. Does the organization want faster turnaround without loss of quality? Does it want more consistent classification? Does it want better access to internal knowledge while preserving human review for sensitive cases? Does it want fewer missed escalations without overwhelming staff with false alarms? Once those questions are answered, the team can define success in terms that align with the real workflow rather than chasing numbers that look good in isolation but mean very little operationally. Failure conditions are just as important as success criteria, yet they are often discussed too late. Before development begins, a responsible team should ask what would count as unacceptable behavior from the system. Would it be unacceptable if the tool gave overly confident wrong answers in sensitive cases? Would it be unacceptable if the system performed much worse for a certain group of users? Would it be unacceptable if staff came to rely on it so heavily that they stopped using their own judgment? Would it be unacceptable if the system encouraged a use beyond the one originally approved? Defining these failure conditions early has two advantages. First, it helps the team design better controls, testing, and oversight from the start. Second, it forces leaders to confront trade-offs honestly before they become attached to the idea of launching the system. A project with no clearly defined failure conditions is often a project that has not yet faced its own risks seriously enough. Data and workflow reality should also be examined before building, because many use cases look strong in theory but rest on weak operational foundations. A team may assume that it has clean, representative, and relevant data when the actual records are incomplete, inconsistent, outdated, or captured for a very different purpose. It may assume that employees follow a standard process when the real workflow is more informal, variable, and dependent on individual judgment than anyone realized. It may assume that labels used in historical data represent objective truth when they actually reflect old habits, inconsistent practices, or past bias. Good use case definition, therefore, includes asking what inputs exist, how reliable they are, who created them, what they were originally meant for, and whether the surrounding business process is stable enough to support the proposed system. If the data is weak or the workflow is chaotic, building AI too early often automates confusion rather than improving anything meaningful. Risk identification belongs in the pre-build stage for the same reason. Many people think risk review comes after a prototype exists, but by then the organization may already be emotionally committed to the project. Early risk review helps a team ask what harms are reasonably foreseeable in the proposed use case, who might experience those harms, and what conditions could make them more likely. The harms may involve privacy, fairness, safety, reliability, manipulation, over-reliance, exclusion, reputational damage, or legal exposure. Some risks come from the output itself, while others come from how people may interpret or misuse the output. For example, a low-risk drafting assistant may become higher risk if managers start treating its text as authoritative without review, or if the system begins to shape communications in sensitive situations where nuance matters deeply. Pre-build risk thinking is not about killing every project. It is about shaping the project early enough that serious problems can be reduced, contained, or recognized before the organization builds momentum around a weak idea. Constraints and operating conditions also need to be defined in advance because no AI system exists in a vacuum. The proposed use case may need to fit privacy obligations, industry rules, internal policies, accessibility expectations, response time needs, budget realities, staffing limits, security requirements, or integration limitations with existing systems. If those constraints are ignored until late in development, the organization may end up with a system that works technically but cannot be deployed responsibly or sustainably. This is one reason business context is more than mission language. It includes the practical realities of the environment the system must live inside. A support assistant that takes too long to answer, a document tool that cannot protect sensitive content properly, or a decision aid that requires a level of human review the organization cannot staff will all struggle in practice, no matter how impressive the underlying model may seem. Strong governance starts by respecting the conditions the system must survive, not just the functions it might perform. There is also a deeper strategic question that responsible teams ask before building any AI system. Does this problem really require AI at all? That is not a cynical question. It is a governance question. Some business problems are better solved through better training, clearer policy, simpler workflow design, improved search, more consistent forms, stronger knowledge management, or a traditional rule-based tool. A team that decides too quickly that AI is the answer may skip cheaper, safer, and more explainable options. In many cases, the right pre-build discussion is not which model to use, but whether the organization truly needs a predictive or generative system in the first place. This question becomes especially important in higher-risk settings, where the cost of added complexity may be much greater than the benefit of partial automation. A mature organization is willing to conclude that a flashy solution is not the best solution, and that judgment itself is a sign of strong governance rather than a failure of imagination. When teams do define the use case well, the result is usually a much stronger starting document for governance and development. That document does not need to be long or overly formal, but it should clearly state the problem being addressed, the intended purpose of the system, the users, the stakeholders affected, the input and output expectations, the workflow it supports, the limits of the system, the success criteria, the key risks, and the constraints that shape design and deployment choices. Once that foundation exists, later work becomes more coherent. Testing can be aligned to the real use case. Oversight can be designed around the actual decision points. Documentation can describe a system that genuinely matches its approved purpose. Monitoring can focus on the outcomes and harms that matter most. In other words, defining business context and use cases early is not an administrative chore before the real work begins. It is the step that makes the rest of the work governable, measurable, and far more likely to succeed in the real world. By the time you finish thinking through this topic, the central lesson should feel straightforward even if it is often ignored in practice. Organizations should not begin with models, data sets, or excitement about capability. They should begin by understanding the business context, defining the use case, identifying stakeholders, clarifying the role of the output, setting boundaries, naming success, recognizing failure, examining data and workflow reality, surfacing risks, respecting constraints, and asking whether AI is actually justified for the problem at hand. That early discipline is what separates thoughtful governance from reactive governance. It does not slow useful work down for no reason. It makes the work clearer, safer, and more defensible from the very beginning. If you remember that before building any AI system, the organization must first define what it is really trying to do and why, then you have captured the heart of this episode and one of the strongest foundations of responsible AI governance.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.